the point is that Richard is wrong about the science, let alone the theology. And the reason for that, in a nutshell, is that Dawkins has what I would see as a very old-fashioned Victorian paradigm whereby matter consists of nothing more than meaningless bits of stuff. And the scientific consensus has moved on. I mean, it's precisely quite hard-nosed physicists or physiologists who, whether they're talking at the quantum level or the level of the cell, there is much more language these days used about cooperation, synergy, symbiosis, relationship. And nature is cooperative. Now, I don't say that's a slam dunk for belief in God. I'm saying that it might make you think twice about some of your preconceptions about what nature is. One of the other criticisms I would make about Dawkins is just simply that he doesn't really understand what he criticizes. So, he will say, for example, these classic arguments of the existence of God, they're all ridiculous. Well, they're only ridiculous because he caricatures them so much. The Bible is only ridiculous in his hands because he takes it as literalistically as the most fervent fundamentalist believer. I don't take the Bible in that way, so I'm not really, I don't lose any sleep over what he may claim to reveal about sort of, loose ends or contradictions or what have you in the Bible. Let me just leave you with this thought. 600 years before Darwin, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Christian thinkers who ever lived in the 13th century, very much in dialogue, incidentally, with Muslims and Jews, because there was much more intellectual commerce. There was a lot of trade in the Mediterranean, which also produced intellectual commerce. And he wrote in one of his commentaries, "Isn't it fitting that God didn't make a ship? God made wood that made itself into a ship." Now, there's an awful lot of interest precisely in cutting-edge science these days, in goal-directedness in nature. As the astronomer royal Martin Rees has said, it does seem natural for galaxies to form. It does seem natural for stars to form and for heavy elements to emerge from the furnaces in stars, and in due course, given the Darwinian principles of selection, for life and intelligence to be favored. So, says Martin Rees, the universe seems to be biophilic and noophilic, that's to say, tending to produce life and intelligence and mind. Now, that takes us, I would argue, a very, very long way from the idea that this is all a squillion to one accident. And I quoted in my talk another distinguished scientist, Freeman Dyson, a physicist of comparable eminence to Stephen Hawking, who said, "To worship God partly entails a confidence that mind and intelligence are woven into the fabric of our universe in ways which altogether surpass our understanding." Now, if Dyson's view is worth taking seriously, and for reasons I spell out in my books, I think there are compelling reasons for taking it seriously, that in turn, I would argue, should lead us to take the great wisdom traditions of the world much more seriously than many opinion formers typically do.
Food for thought. I think food for thought for our listeners. And
very much so.
Yeah, I think that brings this conversation to a close. The main segment of it. Anirudh, do you have anything you want to say?
Just one question that I'm sure all our listeners would also be eager to ask is, has Dawkins ever responded to you personally about your claims against him?
No, he's notorious for ducking any encounter with anyone who might be decently informed. Apart from, to give him his due, he did have a debate with the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford in 2012. That's all on YouTube. It's rather inconclusive. I think I think the event was chaired by Anthony Kenny, who's a famous philosopher who was once a Catholic priest, but who then lost his faith, and who's now an agnostic. And so it was considered that he would be an honest broker. But he chaired the. I have huge respect for Anthony Kenny, but he chaired the event with rather too light a hand on the tiller, I think. So it was all a bit inconclusive. But I know other people who have offered to debate with Dawkins, and he hasn't really wanted to take up the baton. I think he's really in his comfort zone when he's debating with very simple fundamentalist believers who perhaps do take large chunks of the Old Testament seriously. But one of the first things you need to grasp when you're getting out of short theological trousers is that the Bible itself nowhere claims to be infallible. If you have a more Catholic, a more classical understanding of the Bible, there's always been a tendency to say, well, let's not pull one leaf off a tree and imagine that single leaf can describe or do duty for an entire landscape. If you want to understand what the Bible is saying as a whole, then you need to read it in context. So yes, okay, granted, there may be this or that verse that makes God appear, angry or vengeful. But if the tenor of that book of the Bible or whatever overall is to emphasize that God's mercy exceeds his judgment or his impulse to punishment or what have you, then it's the bigger picture which counts. And so, just to repeat, I mean, I think that Richard Dawkins is displaying the very naivety and literalism of mind, the sort of black and white view of things that you see in the most simple-minded of believers that he castigates. But he when you're having a serious argument, you owe it to your opponent to consider a serious expression of the alternative point of view, not a straw man. If somebody were to say, I reject all left-wing thought and endeavor because communism has been disastrous and it's been responsible for the death of 100 million people, I think your opponent would be justified in saying, excuse me, I'm not talking about Stalin or Mao. I'm talking about the European social democratic tradition, or what have you. So it's very easy to demonize your opponents and come up with a simplistic caricature of what they're saying. And needless to say, I mean, this is why social media these days has become so toxic. And what we desperately need is it's to dial down all the anger. And while Dawkins tends to ridicule anyone who believes in God, I would just say that I have always been clear from the word go that I respect atheism as a worldview, and if if your conscience and your intellect tell you to be an atheist, then for goodness sake, be an atheist. It's hardly a very rebellious option or unusual option in the 21st century. But if you're going to to give religion a whirl, then for heaven's sake, consider a decently informed expression of it, and not the joke that Richard Dawkins offers.